This is a story I read a while ago while I was doing research, historical research. I don't know whether this really happened this way, but I'm going to give a summary of the story here, and I'm going to use it as a parable. Okay, in the background of this video, you see the British Raj. That's how the British rule of India, of South Asia, was called. The British took over the area. They kicked the Danish and Portuguese and even French out of their settlements, most of them. And the British went in a contract with the local sultans and the local Indian kings and chiefs, and that's how the Indian Empire was established, which was an a British colony with a large degree of autonomy. So the king of Britain was also the emperor of India. So I just want to explain that first. But before the empire was declared, the British had already had a small territory they ruled in India. In this territory, there were snakes in the villages, and the British, they want to get rid of the snakes. But they couldn't do it on their own. They didn't have the knowledge of the environment. So there were local Indians that said to the English authorities, or let me say British authorities, British authorities, that they know how to capture snakes. And indeed, those men knew how to lure and capture serpents. So those men, every month, they would do their best and they would capture around maybe between 10 to 30 serpents. And the British authorities began to pay them for it, for their efforts, because the British governor at the time knew how dangerous that job was to capture serpents. Any of those men that volunteered to help the English authorities, they could have died anytime. So the English were very happy with their service. Also, there were also Indian civilians under British rule that were happy with it. After about 5 years, there were some greedy men and women that thought, hold on a minute, what those volunteers are doing, we can do it far better. At this time, most of the serpents in the area were exterminated. There were only very few snakes left. How did people know that? Because serpents would breed, and they would leave eggs, and out of those eggs new serpents would come. And the serpents would have certain places in the environment where they would leave their eggs behind, and there were very few eggs. So people knew the issue was almost over. But those greedy people decided, no, we can't let it happen. They began to breed new snakes. They would breed around 30 to 80 serpents. And every half year, they would hand over those serpents to the British authorities over there. At this time, Britain had gained more control upon India. So they had more money, so the compensation went up. And many of the people around decided to benefit from this business of breeding serpents, because it became a business, and both rich and poor benefited from it. After 20 years, now you had a new policy in the British Empire. And there was a new governor who just arrived from London, and he studied this and he began to think, hold on a minute, how come there are so many snakes around? The governor asked one of the people, who was one of the administrators, how many snakes have been handed in past month? And the guy went to the archives and he said around 180. And the governor asked, what about the month before? 70. And when they went throughout the whole documentation, they found out that past 20 years, around 6,700 serpents had been handed in. And the governor was thinking, hold on a minute, if there are so many snakes around here in the wild, nobody would be able to live here, because those snakes would have attacked the livestock, they would have ruined the farms, and they would have attacked people all the time. So when the government realizes, hold on a minute, something's wrong here. At this time, the governor sent out inquiries. He sent out a commission to the other side of India to investigate, and he found out that there were other places in India that the same thing happened. There were not that many, but about hundreds of snakes were handed in past 15 years. And the governor realized, hold on a minute, this has become a business over here. He did an investigation. He found out that there were farms breeding serpents. Those people were arrested, others were fined, and the business and the snakes were killed. So the other people that became rich through this knew that their income would disappear. But many peasants and civilians invested in these serpent breeding farms. And now you had around, throughout the British India, you still had around maybe 15,000 serpents on those farms, because they were bred to be handed over to be killed. That's why they were bred, and the people would be paid. That was the purpose. But now there was no compensation anymore for handing in serpents. Anyone who would come and hand in a serpent now would be fined and jailed by the English authorities. So what happened? Those farmers that owned those serpent breeding, I would call cabins, they released all the serpents into the wild, because they thought they didn't want to keep it, because there was no benefit for them keeping those serpents. After a while, a lot of people encountered serpents in their backyards, and serpents even in their bedrooms that they crept in. And this happened throughout British India. Now, a lot of people were thinking, where do all those serpents come from? Now, there were people, civilians and peasants, that invested in this serpent breeding industry, but it was not the majority. After a while, when a lot of people they were fed up with all those serpents appearing everywhere, they began to do research themselves apart from the government, and they found out that there were greedy people, greedy families breeding those serpents. And well, now those serpents were in the wild and people had to deal with them, but they had no idea how to deal with them. Because, let me say, around 30 years ago, when the English began to compensate to volunteers that captured serpents, there were very few serpents around. Very few. Because those serpents were the prey of other animals in the wild. So there was a balance in the ecosystem. But due to greed, now you had thousands of serpents around, while it used to be only hundreds. And even those hundreds would die off quickly. So now there was an imbalance that people had to deal with, but they had no means to deal with it. Now, this story, that is not how I read it in the historical research. It was a very short story, but I adapted it. I've brought more depth into it. I've invented more depth into the account. So what I just said was a fictive account, but I'm using it to illustrate something here. Now I'm going to use a real account. This was from a documentary, a crime documentary from Britain. In the south of Britain, there was this, I don't know if it was near London, but it was a small town where you had this Indian family living. And you had this teenage girl who was 14 years old. She attended a high school, as most girls in Britain around that age do, by law. One day, this girl did not come to school anymore. So people began to ask the relatives to call it home, and the parents just wouldn't answer. Or later, an uncle would tell them, well, she's sick. But the school became suspicious, so they sent the police over there, and they found out that girl was killed. I mean, she was murdered. There was a whole investigation done, and later people found out that the husband of that family, he was addicted to anger. He would rage often, and he would take out his rage on his children. And that 14-year-old daughter, she was the target of that man for years, since her late childhood. Since she was about 8 to 9 years old and onwards, she became the target. Now, people in the family, they don't want to deal with the rage of the husband. Not even the extended family, like uncles, aunts, nephews, and grandparents want to deal with it. So they took the easy road by blaming that child as the problem child. And also cousins and other relatives began to believe that that girl was causing trouble in the family. So they began to hate her. They began to not liking her. And after a while, this not liking, they manifested into verbal abuse. And let me say, a cloud of negativity grew around that Indian girl, who was a young teenager. And this dark cloud followed her to school. So at school, there were pupils that sensed this heavy energy and they reacted against it. Because people often react to energy fields without realizing that that's what they're doing. There were some people at the school that began to bully her. So now not only at home she was targeted, also at school. This was destroying her mentally. One day at home she decided she had enough and she began to open her mouth and defend herself, and the brothers and also the cousins, nieces that were at home over there was a family gathering, they all lashed out against her. They all lost their mind. They raged out of control. They all began to beat her and she died. And the police arrested many people of that family. This is something that really happened. I don't have the link here because I watched it on television. At the time I used to watch television a lot, and not that much anymore. When I look at this case, I begin to think, hold on a minute. Someone must have noticed around there that something was wrong with that family. Someone must have noticed that that girl used to have a sad appearance. Someone must have noticed something around there. But people don't want to interfere because it's so-called it's not their business. People value privacy. They don't want to be bothered, so they don't bother others. And because they hold high this privacy myth, which is a myth. By the way, I'm not saying you have to get involved with all affairs. I'm not saying that. There are times you have to keep yourself out of some affairs, okay? But this whole idea that people have this sacred space around them in their interactions that needs to be guarded because it's their private life. You can't come in, or else the people are getting upset and something bad's going to happen. That whole mentality is bullcrap. And people need to let it go. Because that teenage girl, she could have been rescued. She could have been alive till this day. She could have been married now. She could have children. She could have a life. But it was taken away from her. Not just by her relatives, but by people around in the neighborhoods that were too cowardly to open their mouths and act out. But now there was a manifestation. That girl was killed. Now the pupils at school, they're now traumatized. for life that someone that went to their school that they knew was murdered by their own relatives. Also, the people in that town that lived over there, they're also now embarrassed because a lot of people going to ask, how can this abuse go on for so many years and nobody noticed anything? So now they have to make excuses to explain to other people when they ask for it, or they need to pretend it never happened. Another illustration, this is an illustration. Let's say that you have a town where people have this attitude, if you don't like someone, just be open and say it. They have this attitude that as long that you just have to, shouldn't be two-faced, you shouldn't be hypocrite, you have to say what you think. Just be direct. So people began to be direct. And feelings were hurt, but people thought, okay, at least they're honest. Now, it went further. People began to just say what they thought. So after a while, you had this tense, bitter climate in that town. And everyone was enraged because they were honest. They said a lot of things that they shouldn't say. They acted in ways they shouldn't act. And people became terrified because people were so, how do I say it? So, I don't want to say rude, but they were so offensive with their language that after a while people became sick, physically sick, due to the tense climate in that town. So you had a lot of people that were burnt out, they had psychological issues, they were stressed out, and some even lost it and became physically violent. So you had a lot of incidents in that, not the town, let's say in a big city. You had a lot of violent incidents where people lost it. So a lot of people had to become patients as psychiatrists to receive treatment. So after several years, an inspector at the National Police began to investigate this city, and he realized the crime rate was very high. There were a lot of stabbings. There was a lot of domestic violence. There were a lot of people going missing. There were a lot of mentally ill patients that lost it. And then the police officer was thinking, hold on a minute. How come that this town has such a high crime rate? And the police inspector decided to visit the town. And he saw that people never wanted to take accountability for how they felt. Anytime people encountered something that wasn't in agreement with how they thought or what they wanted, they would lash out. And this police inspector was thinking, what the heck is this? The police officer was always taught by experience that if he had an issue with something, it was him having an issue with something. His parents taught him to hold people accountable. His parents taught him, Jerry, you should blame others that ought to be blamed. Don't follow this bullcrap that you should never blame others. Look, there are people who just don't want to take any responsibility for anything. They just blame others to be relieved. We're not teaching you that, but we do teach you to hold people accountable. And of course, when you don't like someone, it's you having bad thoughts about the other individual. Don't expect the other to carry your darkness. His parents taught him how to be accountable towards others. So Jerry thought that all people received this. For him, it was normal for him to reflect upon himself and to give an account of how he was feeling. Jerry never saw someone and felt bad and began to blame the other for how he was feeling. Jerry never just spoke what was in his mind. Jerry often evaluated, hold on a minute, why am I thinking like this? Jerry had no knowledge of the spiritual realm. Alright? But when Jerry felt uncomfortable, he didn't just point it onto others. He acknowledged that he was uncomfortable. And when someone used cuss words or swear words, he knew those were just social conventions. So he knew if he became annoyed when people were cussing or swearing, it was his own fault for being upset because he was holding on to a societal convention. Because he knew those words are just words. They had no power in themselves. Jerry learned how to be emotionally intelligent and responsible, both towards himself and towards others. He knew that it was ridiculous to generate a negative climate towards someone because people don't like that individual, and to blame the target for not being liked. He knew it was stupid. He knew that it would lead to dangerous circumstances because Jerry knew, as a police officer, that when people are uncomfortable and they are stuck in rejection, that they lose it. But Jerry thought that this was common sense to everyone. But Jerry, even though Jerry was a experienced police officer, he was 45 years old, he had almost 20 years experience as an officer, he was wrong. Because most people around, especially in that city that was plagued by the high crime rate, most of those people were not emotionally intelligent nor emotionally responsible. Especially in that town where people would just throw everything out, people were just direct. And Jerry began to think, hold on a minute. If someone comes to me and comes to me with a gun and tells me to shoot him, I'm going to say, hold on a minute, and I'm going to call the police and say that there's a mentally ill patient that needs help over here. Jerry said if someone would tell me to punch him, I wouldn't do it. If someone was self-destructive, I'm not going to cooperate with their self-destruction. Jerry thought even if someone asked me for my opinion, I'm first going to ask whether my opinion would be worth it. And if I notice that my thinking was wrong or hurtful, I would repent. I would even make claim that I'm not going to give any opinion because it's not relevant. Jerry said, this is said to some of his colleagues, I'm not just going to throw something out and use an excuse that they ask for it themselves. No, I'm being responsible for what I contribute. And then his colleagues told him, Jerry, I know your parents brought you up with deep knowledge and wisdom, but Jerry, look around you. Most people in the world are selfish. Even those people that claim to follow Jesus, they're very self-centered. They don't want to give up their rights to be negative, their right to so-called have their free will to do wrong. They defend it, they fight for it. And when Jerry listened to them and looked at the town, he realized his colleagues were telling the truth. Jerry realized that the reason that the high crime rate, people disappearing, stabbings, fights in clubs, a lot of domestic violence, children being traumatized, and also, of course, homicide that happened, he realized that they were all the fruit, the manifestation of this dumb mindset that people have a right to will wrong. That you should never go against somebody's will. That you always should accept the will of other people. And Jerry began to think that this teaching is demonic. Because if someone wants to molest a child, are you now going to say, no, you should infringe with their free will, they have a right to will it? No, you wouldn't. And Jerry began to realize, hold on a minute. These people, they benefit from the emotional and mental validation of having their free will defended. So they defend the so-called free will of others, even though their will is wrong and their will should not be protected, promoted, and especially not defended. But Jerry realized that even the churches didn't speak the truth about this matter. Jerry realized that most people were under this deception of so-called honesty. And Jerry one day told his colleagues, listen, during the Second World War, the Nazis dropped bombs on Rotterdam. Now, this was obvious done by the Nazis. People couldn't deny it. In the Vietnam War, there were also bombs. This was another war, another time. There were bombs going off, but it was done by guerrilla fighters. People didn't know who dropped the bombs. And Jerry told his colleagues, listen, it doesn't matter if the bombs were dropped openly, or if they would have been dropped, or would have been exploded covertly. It's still a bomb that went off, and there's still damage. So whether people are honest about their so-called opinions or they're direct with what they think, It doesn't matter. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And if it causes negativity, it causes negativity, and people need to repent. The colleagues agreed with him. And Jerry had to agree that most people, though their self-centeredness and their holding on to validation, they were contributing to the dark climate around them. And Jerry also realized that you could not tell people that they collectively are responsible for all the things that are happening, because people don't want to go against their own will. They don't want to give up they want to give up their will that is not in agreement with Christ. They would fight. They would become violent if you would even tell them that they are responsible. And people that were victimized could never blame the people that permitted the victimization, because they would say you should never blame others. That's very pathetic. You should take responsibility for your own life. And you know what, folks? I've closed the illustration now. You know what? A lot of people have this mentality. And you can never hold them accountable, or else you're blaming, you're doing the blame game. I've given these illustrations to point out to you that worldly people, most of the time, they are in the business of breeding serpents. And serpents, in this case, means empowering demon spirits. Jesus told his disciples that they would tread upon serpents and scorpions. Those are demonic forces. Well, on the other hand, those demonic forces, they have the ability to operate in the human realm by humans aligning their will against Christ. And it's their investment that into the negative that empowers those demons. So, worldly people in general, they are breeding serpents, empowering demonic forces. But when the manifestations come, they don't want to admit that they're the ones empowering it. They will always come with reasons for what they will. They always will come with reasons to defend their will. They will even twist scripture to defend it. And you have many churches that give in to their need to have a reason to hold on to their will that they shouldn't even have, for not having to repent and become accountable. Well, that's how the world is. That's all. Look, whenever there's a manifestation, whether it's in crime or someone else, there's always a root. We often focus on the branches and the leaves, and we don't look at how this came into being. Because when you go and look how things came into being, when you look at the big picture, you're going to find out a lot of ugly stuff. Worldly people in general, they water the roots, but they don't want to deal with the fruit. Others have to deal with the fruit. And people say, well, you should take responsibility. Collectively, people have to take responsibility. I mean, this whole idea that you as an individual are responsible for everything that's going on with you, even in the theoretically, is not possible. So when you hold on to this thinking, you are lying. I know this thinking feels empowering, that you are the cause of everything, but it's a deception. And by you holding on to this thinking, you are letting off the hook the contribution of others. So it's deceptive. Am I saying now that you have to play the victim at others' expense? No, I'm not saying that either. I'm saying is you need to be realistic. Because a lot of people are not realistic. A lot of people want the short-term fix. And that's why that's why Satan comes by with all these counterfeit miracles to relieve the population, but that relief is not dealing with the root. Well, that's it for now. Jesus said to us, we will trample upon scorpions and serpents, which are demonic forces. Well, that's what we have to do as believers, because the world will continue to breed serpents. Don't expect them to change. Well, some will change. Most will not. That being said, remain in prayer and be at peace.